The cornstalks exploded outward in a violent rush of green and gold as 17-year-old Maya Brennan crashed through them, her lungs burning with the kind of fire that comes from running when every cell in your body screams to stop. Behind her, something moved between the rows. Not footsteps exactly, but a presence that displaced the air itself, making the October night feel thick and wrong. Her sneakers pounded against the hard Ohio earth, mud caked on the soles from yesterday's rain, and she could taste copper in her mouth, could feel the stitch in her side threatening to double her over. But she didn't stop, couldn't stop. Because what she'd seen in the clearing, what had looked at her with eyes that weren't eyes at all but rather windows into something vast and hungry and impossibly old, had changed everything she thought she knew about the world. The Henderson farm stretched for 300 acres, and she was somewhere in the middle, surrounded by corn that grew higher than her father's pickup truck, every stalk identical, every row a perfect maze designed to confuse and trap. She'd lived in Millbrook, Ohio her entire life, had played in these fields as a child, but now they felt alien, hostile, like the earth itself had turned against her. Her phone was dead. Had been dead since she'd crossed onto the property an hour ago, the battery draining from full to nothing in seconds, and she had no idea which direction led to safety. Then she heard it. A sound like wind moving through hollow bones. A whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, speaking in a language that predated human tongues, but somehow she understood its meaning. It said, "You shouldn't have come here." And Maya realized with a horror that froze her mid-stride that the entity wasn't chasing her at all. It was herding her towards something waiting in the darkness ahead, something that had been waiting for a very, very long time. If you connect with my story, please press the like button to find some light in this priest's heart. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next life stories, and tell me about them in the comments where you are watching this video and what time it is right now. It makes me very happy to know that, from any corner of the country or the world, you are listening to me. The thing about being something that exists between states of matter, between thought and form, is that humans always get it wrong. They see movement in the corn and think, predator. They feel the displacement of air and think, danger. They never consider that what watches from between the rows might be watching over them, not hunting them. For 214 years, the entity that would eventually be called the Watcher had existed in the cornfields of what became Ohio, born from the soil itself in a way that human understanding couldn't quite grasp. It wasn't a ghost. Those were echoes, fragments. It wasn't a demon. Those were inversions, perversions of something that once was whole. The Watcher was something else entirely, a consciousness that emerged from the land when the first settlers planted their seeds in earth that had been sacred to the Shawnee, when human desperation and indigenous pain mixed with soil and rain and created something new, something aware. And tonight, as it moved through Henderson's cornfield, tracking the Brennan girls' panicked flight, it felt something it had never quite felt before. Not hunger, not curiosity, but something closer to what humans might call dread. Maya Brennan hadn't come to the cornfield by accident, and the Watcher knew this even if she didn't yet understand it herself. 3 nights ago, her younger brother Timothy, 12 years old, gap-toothed smile obsessed with card tricks, had disappeared while walking home from his friend's house. The police had searched. The community had formed prayer circles. But no one had found anything except a single sneaker beside County Road 17, right where it bordered the Henderson property. Maya knew what adults didn't want to admit. Millbrook, Ohio, had a history. Every 7 years, like clockwork since 1923, a child vanished near the cornfields. Sometimes their bodies turned up months later, miles away, with no explanation for how they got there or what had happened in between. Sometimes they never turned up at all. The police blamed drifters, wild animals, drowning in the creek that ran through neighboring properties. But Maya had spent months in the Millbrook Public Library, had read every newspaper archive, had traced every disappearance back through generations. The pattern was too precise, too deliberate. And now Timothy was gone, and she'd come to the one place everyone told her to avoid, the old Henderson farm, where the corn grew tallest and the shadows felt wrong even in daylight. The Watcher had been there for every single disappearance Maya had researched, had witnessed each one from between the stalks, and the weight of that knowledge pressed against its consciousness like stones piled on a chest. It remembered 1923, when little Sarah Yoder had wandered into the cornfield chasing fireflies and found something else instead. Remembered 1930 during the Depression, when Marcus Webb had run away from home and made it exactly 40 yards into the corn before the trap claimed him. Remembered every 7 years after that, the pattern repeating with mechanical precision and its own helplessness growing with each cycle. Because here was the truth the Watcher had learned in its 2 centuries of existence. It wasn't the only thing living in these fields. There was something older, something that had been here before the Shawnee, before the glaciers, something that slept in the deep earth and woke hungry at specific intervals, dictated by astronomical alignments the Watcher could sense but not understand. The Watcher had been born to guard against it, had emerged from the soil as a kind of immune response, the land's own attempt to protect what grew above from what festered below. But it had never been strong enough to stop the feedings entirely, only to witness, only to remember, only to carry the weight of all those lives it couldn't save. Maya slowed her pace as the corn began to thin, her breath coming in ragged gasps that created small clouds in the October chill. Ahead, she could see a break in the stalks, a clearing of some kind, maybe 50 feet across. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to find another way, but she could still feel that presence behind her, could still sense something guiding her path like a sheepdog moving livestock. Her hands trembled as she pushed through the final row of corn and stepped into the clearing, and what she saw there drove all thoughts of flight from her mind. The clearing was perfectly circular, the earth bare and packed hard as concrete. In the center stood 7 stones arranged in a pattern she recognized from her research, the same pattern that appeared in Shawnee burial grounds, in ancient Celtic sites, in places humans had always known without quite knowing why. And in the space between the stones, something moved. Not moved exactly, fluctuated like heat shimmer on summer asphalt, like reality itself was uncertain about what existed there. Maya took a step forward, then another, drawn by a compulsion that overrode her fear. The fluctuation strengthened, began to take shape. She could almost see faces in it, dozens of faces, hundreds maybe, all young, all twisted in expressions of terror and confusion. And then she understood. This was where they went. Not just Timothy, but all of them. Every 7 years for a century. They were still here, trapped in whatever that shimmer was, suspended between life and death, between earth and whatever lay beneath. The Watcher emerged from the corn at the clearing's edge, allowing itself to become visible in a way it rarely did. To Maya's eyes, it appeared as a figure made of rustling stalks and dried leaves, of shadow and soil, roughly humanoid, but fundamentally other. Its voice, when it spoke, sounded like wind through autumn fields, like the whisper of corn silk against itself, like the deep groan of roots stretching into dark earth. "You shouldn't see this," it said, and the words carried 2 centuries of regret. No one should see this. Maya spun toward the sound, eyes wide, but she didn't run. Something about the figure struck her not as threatening, but as profoundly sad, as tired in a way that transcended mere physical exhaustion. "Where's my brother?" she demanded, her voice cracking. "Where's Timothy?" The Watcher moved closer, each step causing small cornstalks to sprout from the earth and immediately wither. "How's there?" it said, gesturing toward the shimmer. "They're all there, and I don't know how to get them out." What happened next would change everything. Maya Brennan, 17 years old, daughter of a laid-off factory worker and a dental hygienist, student council vice president and decent but not exceptional volleyball player, did something that surprised both herself and the ancient entity watching her. She didn't scream, didn't faint, didn't try to run. Instead, she walked straight toward the shimmer, her hand outstretched, moving with the kind of determined calm that comes when fear crosses a threshold into something else entirely. "Maya, no," the Watcher started, moving faster than wind through the corn, but she'd already touched it, already made contact with whatever existed between the stones, and the moment her fingers brushed that fluctuating space, everything changed. The shimmer exploded outward in a wave of cold that turned Maya's breath to ice crystals, that made frost spread across the packed earth in fractal patterns. The faces she'd seen before suddenly became clear, dozens of children, all frozen in the moment of their taking, all aware but unable to move or speak or die. And there, near the center, was Timothy, 12 years old, still wearing his Cardinals t-shirt. His eyes met hers, and she could see him trying to scream, trying to reach for her. But the shimmer held him fast. Something else emerged from the space between the stones, not another entity but a presence, vast and ancient and absolutely starving. It had noticed her, had felt her touch, and now it wanted her too. The Watcher reacted on instinct, on 200 years of futile observation suddenly crystallizing into action. It threw itself between Maya and the presence, manifesting fully for the first time since its creation, becoming solid enough that when the hunger from below struck, it struck something that could be hurt. The impact sent shockwaves through the clearing, caused cornstalks for acres around to bend as if in a violent storm. Maya was thrown backward, landing hard on the packed earth, the wind knocked from her lungs. Through blurring vision, she saw the Watcher, saw it not as a vague shape, but as something almost human, a man maybe, or the memory of a man, dressed in clothes from another century, with eyes that held the weight of every child it had failed to save. It was screaming, she realized, but not in pain, in rage, in defiance. The presence from below wrapped around it like smoke, like tentacles made of absence itself, pulling it down toward the earth, toward the space between the stones. And the Watcher was losing. Maya could see it being absorbed, being consumed, its form beginning to dissolve back into shadow and soil. In seconds it would be gone, and then nothing would stand between her and that ancient hunger. She did the only thing she could think of. She grabbed a rock from beside one of the standing stones, heavy, ancient, covered in markings she couldn't read, and threw it with every ounce of strength she possessed. Not at the presence, not at the Watcher, but at the shimmer itself, at the space where all those children were trapped. The stone struck true, passed through the fluctuation like it was water, and something inside that impossible space shattered. The sound was like glass breaking, like ice cracking on a frozen lake, like the world itself taking a sharp breath. The shimmer collapsed inward, then exploded outward again, and this time, when the wave of cold hit, it brought something with it. The children. All of them. Timothy and Sarah Yoder and Marcus Webb and dozens more, spanning a century of disappearances, tumbling out of that impossible space and onto the hard earth of the clearing. They were gasping, crying, confused, but they were alive. Every single one of them alive, exactly as they'd been in the moment of their taking, wearing clothes from the 1920s, the 1950s, the 1980s, all of them blinking in the October moonlight like they'd just woken from a nightmare. The presence from below shrieked, a sound felt rather than heard, a vibration that made teeth ache and bones resonate, and retreated, pulling back into whatever depths it had emerged from. The standing stones cracked, one by one, ancient power finally exhausted, and the Watcher collapsed to its knees in the center of the clearing, its form flickering, unstable, like a candle flame in high wind. Maya scrambled to her feet, ran to Timothy, pulled him into her arms. He was solid, real, warm. He was sobbing into her shoulder, asking what happened, asking if he could go home, asking why he felt so cold. Around them, the other children were experiencing similar reunions with decades and centuries, weeping or laughing or sitting in stunned silence. But Maya's eyes were on the Watcher, on the entity that had saved her, that had protected them all. "Thank you," she whispered, and the Watcher looked at her with those ancient eyes and managed something that might have been a smile. The aftermath was chaos of a kind Millbrook, Ohio had never seen. Children who'd been missing for days appeared suddenly in the Henderson cornfield, dazed but unharmed. Children who'd been missing for decades appeared too, and then for generations, a whole crowd of impossible returns that sent the entire town into a frenzy of disbelief, joy, and existential terror. The police came first, then the news crews, then the federal agents who asked questions no one could answer. How had they survived? Where had they been? Why hadn't they aged? No one had good explanations. The children themselves couldn't quite articulate what they'd experienced. It was like being caught in a dream, they said, like being frozen in a single moment that stretched into forever. Maya told the authorities she'd found them in the clearing, that they'd just been there, that she couldn't explain it. She didn't mention the shimmer, or the presence from below, or the entity made of corn and shadow that had stood between her and ancient hunger. Some truths, she understood, weren't meant to be shared. Some truths would destroy the fragile rationality people needed to function in the world. In the days that followed, Millbrook transformed. Families were reunited across temporal chasms. Sarah Yoder's great-great-grandchildren met her, a little girl of 7 who'd vanished in 1923 and returned unchanged 97 years later. Marcus Webb found himself in a world where his younger siblings were now elderly or dead, where everything he'd known had become history. The town set up counseling services, support groups, arranged housing and identification for people who'd been erased from official records decades ago. It was messy and complicated, and occasionally heartbreaking, but there was also joy, pure, uncomplicated joy at having lost ones returned, even if the circumstances defied all logic. Timothy Brennan went home to his parents' house on Maple Street, where his mother held him and sobbed and refused to let go for 3 hours straight. He returned to school, to his card tricks, to his normal 12-year-old life, though sometimes Maya would catch him staring at nothing, a distant look in his eyes, and she knew he was remembering. Remembering the cold, remembering the hunger, remembering being trapped in that impossible space. Maya herself changed in ways both obvious and subtle. She'd seen too much to return to her previous life unchanged, had touched something ancient, and emerged with knowledge that sat in her chest like a stone. She started spending more time in the cornfields, walking the rows in daylight, searching. She knew the Watcher was still there, could feel it sometimes, a presence just beyond perception, watching from between the stalks. Sometimes she'd find small signs, corn stalks arranged in patterns, stones stacked in cairns, footprints in the dirt that led nowhere. The entity hadn't left, was still guarding, still protecting against the thing that slept below. 2 weeks after the incident, Maya returned to the clearing. The standing stones were gone, reduced to rubble, but the circular shape remained, the earth still packed hard and bare. She stood in the center and spoke to the empty air. "I know you're here," she said. "I know you're listening." The corn rustled, though there was no wind. "You saved my brother, saved all of them, but you've been alone out here for 200 years, haven't you? Just watching, just failing to stop it, just carrying all that weight by yourself." The rustling grew stronger, more agitated. "Well, you don't have to be alone anymore," Maya said. "I'm going to help you. I'm going to figure out what that thing is, where it came from, how to stop it for good. And you're going to teach me everything you know." Silence. Then, from everywhere and nowhere, the Watcher's voice. "Why?" "Because," Maya said simply, "someone should. Someone should care about the thing that's been caring for us. Someone should help the guardian that's been guarding alone all this time." The Watcher materialized slowly, taking form from shadow and leaves and October air. Up close, in daylight, Maya could see it more clearly than she had in the clearing that night. It was humanoid but not human, tall and thin, with features that seemed to shift between ancient and ageless, between solid and ephemeral. Its eyes were the color of turned earth after rain, deep brown shot through with gold, and they held such profound weariness that Maya felt her heart break a little. "You can't help me," it said, voice like wind through corn. "This is my burden, my purpose. I was made for this." "Maybe," Maya replied, "but maybe that's not enough anymore. Maybe the world's changed enough that the old ways don't work. Maybe you need a human partner, someone who can do the things you can't. And what makes you think you can face what lives below? What makes you think you won't end up like all the others I've failed to protect?" Maya smiled, and there was steel in it. "Because I already have faced it. Because I touched the space where it lives and came back. Because my brother is home safe, and I'll be damned if I let that thing take anyone else, ever." The Watcher studied her for a long moment, and something shifted in its expression. Something that might have been hope, or might have been fear, or might have been both. "You don't understand what you're offering," it said. "This isn't a story with a happy ending. This is generations of sacrifice and loss, and watching things you love be destroyed. This is choosing to stand between the world and something it can never know about, can never acknowledge, can never thank you for facing. I know, Maya said. I've read the stories. I know about the Yodas and the Webbs and all the families who lost children. I know the pattern repeats every 7 years when certain stars align. I know something ancient and hungry lives in the deep earth beneath these fields. And I know you've been fighting it alone since the first seeds were planted here. So teach me how to help. Because 7 years from now it's going to wake up hungry again, and next time we need to be ready. The Watcher was quiet for so long, Maya thought it might refuse, might fade back into the corn and never speak to her again. But then it extended one hand, or what served as a hand, something between flesh and root and shadow, and when Maya took it, she felt a connection snap into place like puzzle pieces finding their fit. Images flooded her mind. The first planting, the Shawnee sacred grounds, the moment the hungry thing below first tasted human sacrifice and decided it wanted more. She saw the Watcher's birth, consciousness emerging from violated earth like a scream made manifest, saw 2 centuries of watching, learning, understanding the cosmic cycles that governed the feeding times, saw every child taken, every family destroyed, every moment of helpless observation. And she saw something else. Possibility. The Watcher had always fought alone, had always been constrained by its nature. It could manifest physically only in the cornfields, could only act when the feeding began, could only witness the long years between. But with a human partner, someone who could move freely through the world, who could research and plan and prepare during the dormant periods, who could bridge the gap between supernatural understanding and human action, maybe, just maybe, they could break the cycle. Maybe they could find a way to starve the thing below, to seal it permanently, to end the pattern that had claimed so many lives. When the connection broke, Maya stumbled backward, tears streaming down her face from the weight of what she'd seen, what she'd learned, what she now carried. But she didn't run, didn't reject it. Instead, she wiped her eyes and nodded. "Okay," she said. "I see it now. All of it. And I'm in. We have 7 years to prepare for the next feeding cycle. 7 years to figure out how to stop it, so let's get started." And so began a partnership unlike any Millbrook, Ohio had ever seen, though the town never knew it existed. Maya Brennan, 17 years old, and the Watcher, an entity born from soil and sorrow and the land's desperate need for protection. By day she attended school, played volleyball, maintained the appearance of normal teenage life. But by night and on weekends, and whenever she could steal hours away, she was in the cornfields with the Watcher, learning the patterns of the stars that governed the feeding cycles, learning the history of the land before humans came, the deep geological time when things older than thought had claimed the earth as theirs, learning about other places, other guardians, other entities that stood between humanity and the hungry dark. The Watcher taught her things that weren't in any book, knowledge that predated language, understanding that came not from words, but from direct transmission of experience and memory. Maya's parents noticed the changes, their daughter spending more time outdoors, coming home smelling of soil and corn pollen, filling notebooks with diagrams and calculations they couldn't decipher. They worried, naturally, thought maybe the trauma of Timothy's disappearance and miraculous return had affected her more deeply than she admitted. But Maya was still pulling good grades, still participating in school activities, still present for family dinners, just also pursuing something else, something they couldn't see. Timothy knew, though. Brothers and sisters who've shared trauma have a way of understanding each other beyond words, and he could see the way Maya had changed, the weight she now carried, the purpose that drove her. One night, 3 months after the incident, he found her in her room surrounded by maps of the Henderson farm, geological surveys, star charts, and obscure books on indigenous folklore. "You're trying to stop it from happening again," he said, not a question but a statement. Maya looked up, considered lying, but Timothy deserved the truth. "Yeah," she admitted. "I am. Me and, someone. Something. That helped us that night." "The thing in the corn," Timothy said. "The one that felt sad." Yes, that one. We're working together now. Timothy nodded, processing this with the remarkable adaptability of 12-year-olds. Good, he said finally, because I remember what it felt like, being trapped there. And if you can make sure no one else has to feel that way, then I'm glad you're doing it. Even if it's scary, even if it's dangerous. The first real breakthrough came 6 months into their partnership. Maya was researching Shawnee creation myths in the library when she found a reference to something called the Beneath Walker, a spirit that existed before the first people, before the sun and moon took their current forms. According to the fragmentary accounts, the Beneath Walker had been sealed away by ancient agreements, relegated to the deep earth, but it grew hungry in cycles aligned with certain celestial movements. Every time specific stars aligned in the autumn sky, it woke ravenous, and if it wasn't fed, it would break free and consume everything above ground. The original peoples had made a terrible bargain. They would provide sacrifices, and in return, the Beneath Walker would stay sealed. But the sacrifices had to be innocent, had to be young, had to be willing or unknowing. When Europeans arrived and the indigenous peoples were displaced, the bargain broke. The Beneath Walker woke hungry, and with no one to perform the proper rituals, it took what it needed by force. That's when the pattern of disappearances began, the entity reaching up through the earth, claiming children at random every 7 years when the stars aligned. And that's when the Watcher was born, the land's own defense mechanism. Trying to maintain balance, trying to prevent the Beneath Walker from taking too much, from breaking free entirely. Maya brought this information to the cornfield, to the clearing where the standing stones had once been, and shared it with the Watcher. The entity absorbed the knowledge with visible distress. Learning you're a band-aid solution to a cosmic problem tends to do that. So we can't kill it, Maya said, thinking through the implications. It's too big, too old, too fundamentally woven into this place. But maybe we can reseal it. Find a way to put it back to sleep without the feeding cycle, without the sacrifices. The original bargain required willing cooperation, the Watcher said. The Shawnee priests knew the rituals, knew how to channel the Beneath Walker's hunger into the earth itself, into growth and fertility rather than consumption. But that knowledge is lost. Those priests are long dead, the sacred traditions broken. Then we rebuild them, Maya said with more confidence than she felt. We find the scattered pieces and put them back together. We have 7 years. That has to be enough time. What followed was the most intense period of research and preparation Maya had ever experienced. She tracked down descendants of the original Shawnee peoples who'd lived in this region, spoke with elders who still maintained fragments of the old traditions. She studied geology and archaeology, learned about the specific mineral composition of the soil beneath Henderson's farm, about underground water tables and limestone caverns. She corresponded with paranormal researchers, folklorists, anyone who might have pieces of the puzzle. And always the Watcher was there, providing context that no human source could offer, sharing memories of the land before humans, filling in gaps in the historical record. They assembled a team without really meaning to. First came Dr. Sarah Chen, 32 years old, a geology professor at Ohio State University who'd grown up hearing stories about the Millbrook disappearances and had always suspected something stranger than human predators was at work. When Maya approached her with carefully edited versions of the truth, Sarah didn't dismiss it outright. She'd seen too many unexplainable geological formations in her career to believe the Earth kept all its secrets. She helped identify the exact location where the Beneath Walker was sealed, a junction of fault lines and underground caverns that created natural resonance points. Then Elijah Blackwater, 67 years old, Shawnee elder from Oklahoma, whose grandmother had been born in Ohio before the forced relocations. He'd spent his life collecting fragments of broken traditions, trying to piece together what had been lost. When Maya contacted him through academic channels and explained what she was trying to do, he wept. Wept for the children taken, wept for the broken bargains, wept for the chance to maybe make something right. He knew parts of the sealing ritual, remembered stories his grandmother had told, knew which herbs and minerals and invocations had power over things that lived in deep earth. And finally, unexpectedly, came Marcus Webb himself. Now appearing 34 years old but chronologically in his hundreds, one of the children who'd been trapped in the shimmer and returned. He remembered things from his time in that impossible space, remembered feeling the Beneath Walker's consciousness, understanding its nature in ways no one else could. He'd been seeing therapists, trying to integrate his fragmented experience into something coherent, and when he heard about Maya's research, he insisted on helping. "I know what it feels like to be hungry like that," he explained in his first meeting with the group. "Empty in a way that has nothing to do with food, with physical need. It's cosmic hunger, existential hunger. The Beneath Walker isn't evil, it's starving for something it can never have again. And maybe if we understand that, we can find a way to satisfy it without more sacrifices." They met in secret, in Maya's basement on Maple Street, which slowly transformed into a command center filled with maps and artifacts and research materials. Maya's parents, bless them, assumed it was some kind of elaborate school project, maybe a documentary on local history. They brought down sandwiches and encouraged the group, proud that their daughter was so dedicated to learning. If they noticed that some of the meetings happened at midnight, that some of the participants included people who should have been long dead, that sometimes the corn outside the basement window rustled though there was no wind, well, after their son returned from a disappearance that defied all logic, they'd learned not to question miracles too closely. The Watcher couldn't attend these meetings directly. Its nature prevented it from existing fully inside human structures, but it was always present at the edges, watching through windows, communicating with Maya through sensations and images that she'd learned to interpret. They had 5 years now, 5 years until the next alignment, the next feeding cycle, the next time the Beneath Walker would wake hungry. 5 years to assemble a ritual that could reseal it permanently, that could end the pattern of disappearances forever. The pressure was immense, the stakes couldn't be higher. But for the first time in 200 years, the Watcher wasn't facing the problem alone. And for the first time since the original bargain broke, humans and the land's own defenses were working together toward the same goal. The work was grueling, technical, requiring precision that allowed for no error. They needed to identify the exact alignment of stars, the precise moment when the Beneath Walker would be closest to waking. They needed to gather materials from across the region, stones from specific locations, water from certain springs, soil from the original Shawnee settlements, plants that hadn't been cultivated in Ohio for generations. Elijah taught them the fragments of ritual he remembered, but large sections were missing, lost to time and cultural destruction. They had to improvise, to extrapolate from similar traditions, to trust that their intentions might matter as much as the specific forms. Dr. Chen worked on the geological component, calculating where they needed to place the new sealing stones to create a stable formation that would channel the Beneath Walker's energy into harmless dissipation. Marcus volunteered to act as a conduit. Having experienced the Beneath Walker's consciousness directly, he believed he could communicate with it, could help guide it back into dormancy if the ritual worked. Maya coordinated everything, kept everyone on track, made sure no detail was overlooked. And the Watcher provided the grounding, the deep connection to the land itself, the ability to sense when they were on the right path versus chasing dead ends. There were setbacks, times when the research led nowhere, when fragments of ritual contradicted each other, when the sheer impossibility of what they were attempting threatened to overwhelm them. Dr. Chen had a crisis of faith 6 months before the deadline, questioning whether she was experiencing mass delusion, whether any of this was real or if she'd let grief over the disappearances drive her into elaborate fantasy. The Watcher appeared to her directly one night as she sat in her car outside the Henderson farm, made itself visible in ways that left no room for doubt about the supernatural nature of their project. She vomited afterward from the existential shock, then drove home and recalculated all her geological models with renewed determination. Marcus struggled too, experiencing nightmares as the next feeding cycle approached, his memories of being trapped in the shimmer growing more vivid and terrible. Some nights he'd show up at Maya's house at 2 a.m., shaking, needing to talk through the terror with someone who understood. She'd make tea, sit with him, remind him that they were breaking the cycle, that no one else would have to experience what he'd endured. These moments of crisis became moments of deepening commitment, the team bonding through shared purpose and shared fear. Elijah faced his own demons, confronting the weight of cultural traditions he could only partially remember, feeling the absence of his ancestors who should have been there to guide this work. He performed ceremonies alone in the cornfields, asking for forgiveness and assistance, unsure if anyone was listening but needing to try. The Watcher attended these ceremonies, invisible but present, and Elijah could feel it there, could sense the entity's own grief and determination, its desperate hope that this time, finally, they might succeed where 2 centuries of effort had failed. And Maya, just turned 18 now, carried the weight of leadership she'd never asked for, knowing that if they failed, more children would disappear, more families would be destroyed, and it would be partially her fault for trying and not succeeding. The pressure manifested in stress dreams where she was back in the clearing, touching the shimmer, but this time she couldn't pull anyone out, couldn't break the trap, could only watch as faces accumulated in that impossible space forever. She'd wake gasping, and sometimes find the Watcher sitting vigil outside her window, watching over her the way it had watched over the fields for 200 years. These moments of recognition that they were protecting each other now, that the Guardian had its own Guardian, gave her strength to continue. The final 3 months became a sprint. They had to execute everything perfectly, had to time the ritual to the minute, had to place 7 new standing stones in exact locations across the Henderson property in the weeks leading up to the alignment. This required permission from the Henderson family, which Maya obtained by telling them a carefully edited version of the truth, that the disappearances were connected to geological instabilities beneath their land, and that proper stone placement could prevent future tragedies. The Hendersons, who'd been farming this land for 5 generations and had their own suspicions about why children vanished near their property, agreed without asking too many questions. Sometimes people know more than they admit, know that certain truths are better approached sideways than head-on. They placed the first stone, a massive granite boulder sourced from a quarry 200 miles north, on June 15th, positioning it precisely according to Dr. Chen's calculations. The moment it settled into place, Maya felt a shift in the air, like the earth itself was breathing differently. The Watcher appeared beside her, its form more solid than she'd ever seen it, and touched the stone with something like reverence. "It remembers," it said quietly. "The stone remembers the old ways. We might actually do this." 6 more stones followed over the next 12 weeks, each one a logistical nightmare of moving multi-ton boulders across farmland without modern equipment. They couldn't risk metal or engines, had to use wooden rollers and rope and human muscle, had to do it the way the original peoples had done it thousands of years ago. The work was backbreaking, but volunteers appeared seemingly from nowhere to help. Families of previous disappearance victims, people who'd never forgotten the losses, who understood on some instinctive level that something important was happening. They didn't ask questions, just showed up, put their backs into the work and went home exhausted but somehow hopeful. By September 15th, 1 month before the alignment, all 7 stones were in place, forming a heptagon around the original clearing with the ruined ancient stones at its center. The geometric precision was so exact that standing at any one stone, you could see a perfect sightline to the 2 adjacent stones, creating an interlocking pattern of power and protection. Elijah performed the first ceremony, walking the pattern while chanting in a language so old most of its words had been forgotten, relying on memory and instinct and the hope that sacred intention mattered more than perfect execution. As he chanted, the stones began to hum, a deep subsonic vibration that made teeth ache and hearts race. Dr. Chen measured it. Exactly 7. 83 hertz, the Schumann resonance, the Earth's own frequency. They were on the right track. The night before the alignment, October 14th, Maya couldn't sleep. She'd done everything she could think of to prepare, but doubt gnawed at her. What if they'd made a critical error? What if the ritual backfired and made things worse? What if the Beneath Walker broke free entirely and consumed not just 7 children but the whole town, the whole region? She left her house at 2 a.m. and drove to the Henderson farm, found the Watcher waiting for her in the clearing, illuminated by moonlight and its own faint phosphorescence. "I'm scared," she admitted, 18 years old, and feeling the weight of 200 years of failure pressing down on her shoulders. What if we can't do this? What if I've led everyone into disaster? The Watcher was quiet for a long moment, and when it spoke, its voice carried a gentleness she'd rarely heard. "I've been scared for 2 centuries, it said. Scared every 7 years when the cycle approached. Scared every time I felt that hunger rising from below. Scared every single moment I couldn't protect the children I was made to guard. But tomorrow, I won't be scared alone. Tomorrow, for the first time since I came into being, I'll have partners who understand what we're facing, who chose to stand beside me, not because they were created for it, but because they decided it mattered. Whatever happens tomorrow, that means something. That changes something fundamental." Maya looked at the entity, this creature of corn and shadow and soil, this guardian that had carried impossible weight alone for so long, and felt her fear transform into something else. Not confidence exactly, but determination, purpose, the understanding that some things matter enough to risk everything, that some battles have to be fought regardless of the odds. "Then let's make it count," she said. "Let's end this cycle. Let's give you the rest you deserve and protect every child who'll never know what we prevented." The Watcher reached out, and Maya took its hand, easier now after months of contact, the initial wrongness of touching something that existed between states of matter having faded into familiarity. They stood together in the clearing, in the center of the stone heptagon, and waited for dawn, for October 15th, for the moment when the stars would align and the Beneath Walker would wake hungry, and they would either stop it forever or fail more catastrophically than anyone had failed before. The corn rustled around them, a sound that had become Maya's soundtrack, and she found it oddly comforting. This place that had been a source of terror for generations, this field where children had vanished, had become something else through their work. A battleground, yes, but also a place of possibility, of hope, of humans and nature working together toward mutual protection. October 15th dawned cold and clear, the Ohio sky that particular shade of autumn blue that feels almost aggressive in its intensity. Maya's team assembled at the Henderson farm by 8 a.m. Though the actual ritual wouldn't begin until sunset, the alignment occurred at the exact moment when the sun crossed the horizon and 3 specific stars became visible in the east, a convergence that happened once every 7 years. They spent the day in final preparations, walking the stone circle, rehearsing each person's role, double-checking calculations that had already been checked 100 times. The air felt heavy, pregnant with potential, like the hours before a thunderstorm. Townspeople began arriving around noon, though they weren't supposed to. Word had spread somehow that something important was happening at the Henderson farm, and people came carrying candles and photos of lost children, lining the edges of the property in silent vigil. Maya wanted to send them away, worried their presence would disrupt the ritual, but Elijah stopped her. "They should be here," he said. "The original ceremony involved the whole community. Their presence, their witnessing, their hope. It's part of the energy we need to channel. Let them stay." So they stayed, hundreds of people eventually, former residents who'd moved away and returned for this, families who'd lost children decades or generations ago, people who'd felt the wrongness in these fields and wanted to see it healed. They formed a vast outer circle around the stone heptagon, creating a ring of human intention and hope that stretched for acres. At 6:47 p.m., as the sun touched the western horizon and the first stars appeared in the east, they began. Elijah stood at the central stone, the largest one, and started the opening invocations in fragmented Shawnee that he'd pieced together from memory and research. Dr. Chen moved to each of the 7 stones in sequence, using a copper rod to test the resonance, to ensure the energy flow was correct. Marcus positioned himself at the exact center of the clearing where the original stones had stood, where the shimmer had existed, where the connection to the Beneath Walker was strongest, and Maya stood beside the Watcher at the northern point of the heptagon, the gateway position, the place where Earth energy was most concentrated. The plan was simple in theory, viciously complex in execution. They needed to create a resonance pattern that would sink deep into the Earth, reach the place where the Beneath Walker dwelt, and essentially lull it back to sleep while simultaneously reinforcing the seal that kept it contained. The stone circle would act as a focusing lens. The human presence would provide willpower and intention. Elijah's invocations would carry the symbolic weight of the old bargains, and Marcus would serve as a translator, communicating with the Beneath Walker in ways only someone who touched its consciousness could manage. The Watcher would anchor everything, using its connection to the land itself to channel the combined energies into the deep earth. And Maya, for reasons none of them fully understood but all of them felt, would be the conduit between human and supernatural, the bridge that made the whole thing possible. As Elijah's chanting reached a crescendo, the stones began to glow, faint at first, then stronger, with a golden light that seemed to come from within the rock itself. Dr. Chen's copper rod sparked and hummed, the resonance building. The hundreds of people in the outer circle began to hum as well, not in any organized way but spontaneously, their individual sounds merging into a unified tone that made the air vibrate. And then they felt it. The Beneath Walker waking below. The ground shuddered, not quite an earthquake but a tremor of awareness, of vast consciousness stirring from slumber. Maya felt it through the soles of her feet, felt the hunger rising, felt that ancient, terrible need for sustenance. Beside her, the Watcher became fully solid for the first time, abandoning all pretense of being incorporeal, becoming a figure as real and physical as Maya herself. It was taking a huge risk. Manifesting this completely left it vulnerable, but it was also the only way to channel enough power for the ritual to work. Marcus gasped in the center of the clearing, his eyes rolling back, his body going rigid as he opened himself to the Beneath Walker's consciousness. Maya could see the struggle on his face, the effort of maintaining his own identity, while allowing something vast and alien to flow through him. He started speaking in that same ancient language Elijah was using, but the words came from a deeper place, carried different weight. He was translating the Beneath Walker's perspective, loneliness, isolation, the endless void of sleep without dreams, the periodic waking to hunger that could never truly be satisfied, the desire not for children specifically, but for connection, for acknowledgement, for something to break the eternal monotony of deep earth existence. The insight hit Maya like lightning. They'd been approaching this wrong, or at least incompletely. The Beneath Walker didn't want sacrifices. It wanted communication. It wanted to be remembered, acknowledged, given the respect that ancient things deserve. The children had been attempts at connection, terrible and destructive attempts, but attempts nonetheless. What if they could give it a different kind of sustenance? What if instead of feeding it lives, they could feed it memory, recognition, the understanding that it was known and honored? She grabbed the Watcher's hand and channeled everything she'd learned over the past year. All the research, all the conversations, all the history of this place and its people. She let it flow through her into the Watcher, who pushed it down through the stone circle into the deep earth, down to where the Beneath Walker stirred. The message was simple. We remember you. We acknowledge your age and your isolation and your hunger. We honor what you are and what you've endured. You don't need to take any more. We will remember. We will tell your story. You are not forgotten. You are not alone. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The Beneath Walker's hunger shifted, transformed from destructive need to something else. Not satisfaction exactly, but recognition. It had been seen, had been acknowledged, and for something that had existed in isolation for eons, that meant everything. Elijah's chanting reached a final crescendo. The stone's glow intensified to nearly blinding brightness, and then everything went silent. Perfectly. Absolutely silent. Even the hundreds of people in the outer circle made no sound, held their breath, waited. And then the earth sighed. There's no other way to describe it. A profound exhalation, a release of tension that had been building for generations, a settling. The stone's glow faded to a steady, gentle pulse that would continue, Dr. Chen later measured, for approximately the next 700 years. The seal was renewed, strengthened, made permanent not through sacrifice, but through recognition and respect. The Beneath Walker returned to its deep slumber, no longer hungry, no longer isolated, knowing that above it humans and the land's own guardian remembered its existence and honored it. Marcus collapsed, caught by Elijah before he hit the ground. He was unconscious but breathing, a peaceful expression on his face that suggested whatever he'd experienced in connection with the Beneath Walker had ended on a positive note. The watcher flickered, its solid form beginning to destabilize from the enormous energy expenditure. But before it fully dissolved back into shadow and corn, it looked at Maya and smiled. Actually smiled, with genuine joy and relief, and something that might have been pride. "We did it," it whispered, voice barely audible. 200 years and we finally did it. The crowd erupted into cheers, though most of them didn't fully understand what they'd witnessed, knew only that something profound had occurred, that the wrongness in these fields had finally been healed. People were crying, embracing, holding up photos of lost children who'd been returned the previous year. The Henderson family stood on their porch, 3 generations together, and old Mr. Henderson, 84 years old, who'd lived on this land his entire life and buried the knowledge of its dangers deep in his heart, finally let himself weep with relief. Maya sank to the ground, completely exhausted, and Timothy, who'd been in the outer circle with their parents, ran to her and threw his arms around her. "You did it," he said, 12 years old, and understanding more than any 12-year-old should have to. "You saved everyone. You saved all the kids who would have been taken." She held him tight, her baby brother who'd been her motivation for all of this, and let herself feel the weight lift, the knowledge that they'd broken a 200-year cycle, that no more families would suffer what the Brennans and Yodas and Webbs and so many others had suffered. Dr. Chen was frantically taking measurements, documenting everything while her academic brain struggled to process what she'd participated in. Elijah was sitting cross-legged beside the central stone, head bowed, praying in thanks to ancestors who'd surely been guiding their work. And the watcher, now barely visible, a shimmer of possibility in the October air, moved through the crowd, touching people gently, blessing them in ways they'd never consciously recognize, but would carry with them always. The aftermath was quieter than Maya expected. The news crews that had descended on Millbrook the previous year when children reappeared weren't interested in a story about stones being placed in a cornfield. The ritual, for all its cosmic significance, looked from the outside like a community gathering, a remembrance ceremony for the disappeared. People came and went, left flowers and candles around the stone circle, but within a few weeks, life in Millbrook returned to normal. Except it wasn't normal, not really. Something fundamental had shifted. Children played in the cornfields now without fear. The Henderson farm, which had been avoided for generations, became a place where families picnicked and couples got married beneath the stone heptagon. The air felt lighter, cleaner, like a weight everyone had been carrying without realizing it had finally been lifted. Maya finished high school, graduated with honors, and surprised everyone by choosing to stay in Millbrook for college instead of fleeing to some big city like most bright kids did. She enrolled at the community college, studying environmental science and anthropology because her work wasn't done. The Beneath Walker was sealed, yes, but there were other thin places in the world, other guardians fighting alone, other ancient things that needed to be understood and respected rather than feared or fed. She'd found her calling in that cornfield, and it was bigger than one small Ohio town. The Watcher became a regular presence in her life, though few people besides Maya could see it. It would appear during her evening walks through the fields, would sit with her on her porch during summer thunderstorms, would share its knowledge of the deep patterns that governed the intersection of human and supernatural worlds. Their relationship evolved into genuine friendship, the kind that transcends species and mortality, and the boundaries between flesh and spirit. Marcus Webb became a speaker, traveling to places where similar disappearances occurred, sharing his story and the solution they'd found in Millbrook. He helped other communities identify their own thin places, their own hungry things, their own guardians. He became essentially a paranormal mediator, and he was surprisingly good at it. Dr. Chen published a carefully worded paper on geological resonance patterns in southeastern Ohio that became a cult classic among researchers who suspected there was more to reality than conventional science admitted. She went on to consult on several cases of unusual seismic activity that turned out to be supernatural in nature. Elijah returned to Oklahoma, but maintained close contact with Maya, helping her understand the broader context of indigenous knowledge about the land, about the agreements their ancestors had made with ancient things, about the responsibility that came with being a bridge between worlds. And Timothy, now 13 and obsessed with card tricks and video games and all the normal preoccupations of teenage boys, carried within him the memory of being trapped between moments, of touching something vast and hungry and old. He didn't talk about it much, but sometimes Maya would find him standing at the edge of the cornfields, staring into the rows, and she knew he was remembering. Was honoring, in his own way, the experience that had changed both their lives and the trajectory of their entire town. One evening, almost exactly a year after the ritual, Maya stood in the clearing with the Watcher as the sun set and the stones began their gentle pulse. She'd brought a journal, had been documenting everything she'd learned, everything they'd accomplished, creating a record that future generations might need if the seal ever weakened, if the Beneath Walker ever stirred again. "Do you think it's really over?" she asked the entity beside her. "Or are we just in a longer lull?" The Watcher considered this, its form solidifying slightly in the twilight. "The seal will hold for many human lifetimes," it said. "But nothing is permanent. Eventually the stars will align differently. Eventually the earth will shift. Eventually someone will need to renew what we've done. But that's the work, isn't it? Each generation taking responsibility for maintaining balance, for respecting what came before while adapting to what is. You've begun something, Maya Brennan. A new tradition of partnership between humans and guardians. That's worth more than any permanent solution." Maya nodded, understanding. Some battles aren't won once and forgotten. They're won through constant vigilance, through each generation choosing to remember and act and care. She closed her journal and looked around at the cornfield, at the 7 stones glowing gently in the dusk, at the town of Millbrook, visible in the distance, with its lights beginning to wink on against the coming night. This was home. This was her calling. This was the work she would do for however long she was given. Standing between the world and the things that hungered in the dark, working alongside guardians who'd protected humanity since before humans had language for gratitude. The Watcher placed a hand on her shoulder, the gesture somehow paternal despite being made by an entity that had never been human and never would be. "Thank you," it said quietly, "for seeing me, for helping, for making 2 centuries of failure into 1 moment of success, for giving me a partner after so long alone." "Thank you," Maya replied, "for protecting my brother, for protecting all of them, for carrying that weight alone for so long. You don't have to be alone anymore." They stood together as night fell completely, and the stars emerged. The same stars that had once signaled feeding time, but now simply marked the passage of seasons, the turning of the earth, the endless dance of cosmic forces that humanity barely understood, but occasionally, with effort and courage and partnership, could learn to work with rather than against. In the months and years that followed, Maya Brennan became something rare and precious, a human who chose to stand alongside the guardians most people never knew existed, who committed her life to understanding and protecting the balance between worlds. The cornfields of Ohio whispered her name with the same reverence they'd once whispered warnings. And the Watcher, no longer alone, no longer failing, continued its eternal vigil, knowing that when it needed help, when the next challenge arose, it had a partner who would stand beside it. Some endings are really beginnings. Some guardians find the company they've needed for centuries, and sometimes, just sometimes, a teenage girl with a missing brother and an unbreakable will can change patterns that have persisted for 200 years. The corn grows tall in Millbrook, Ohio. Children play in the fields without fear. And something ancient sleeps beneath, no longer hungry, no longer alone, honored and remembered, and finally at peace. The true measure of what they'd accomplished became clear 7 years later, when October 15th arrived again and the stars aligned exactly as they had before. Maya stood in the clearing with the Watcher, both of them tense despite knowing the seal should hold, and felt nothing. No tremor in the earth. No waking hunger from below. The Beneath Walker slept on undisturbed, satisfied by the recognition and respect they'd given it. The cycle was truly broken. That night, Millbrook held a quiet celebration at the Henderson farm, gathering around the stone circle to mark not a feeding time, but a liberation. 7 years of freedom from fear, 7 years of children growing up safe, 7 years of peace. Maya looked around at the faces in the candlelight. Timothy, now 19 and studying environmental law, wanting to use legal frameworks to protect sacred spaces. Marcus, whose work had helped 5 other communities identify and seal their own dangerous thin places. Dr. Chen, whose research had opened new fields of inquiry into the intersection of geology and the supernatural. Elijah, who'd returned from Oklahoma with 3 younger indigenous scholars, passing knowledge to a new generation. And everywhere, children, dozens of children who would have been taken, who would have been trapped in that horrible shimmer, who were instead present and laughing and alive because a guardian and a teenage girl had refused to accept that some cycles couldn't be broken. The Watcher stood at the edge of the gathering, visible to those who'd learned to see it, and for the first time in its 200-year existence, it allowed itself to feel something other than vigilance and grief. It felt satisfaction. It felt pride. It felt the deep peace that comes from fulfilling your purpose, not through endless sacrifice, but through partnership, through evolution, through learning that sometimes the old ways need new applications. Maya caught its eye across the circle and raised her glass of cider in a silent toast. The Watcher raised its own hand in response, and in that gesture was the acknowledgement of everything they'd shared, everything they'd built together, everything they'd saved. The corn rustled in the October wind, but it was just wind now, just the normal sounds of a living ecosystem, not the movement of something ancient and hungry. The stars turned overhead in their eternal dance, and the Beneath Walker slept, and Millbrook, Ohio breathed easier than it had in a century, and somewhere in the deep earth, in the place where ancient things dwell. A consciousness that had once fed on fear and loss, now fed instead on memory and recognition and respect, and found it far more nourishing than any sacrifice had ever been.